Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Um, Something I should mention right at the top is that this last Monday, we didn't market it very well, but we had a Alamo Day for the Old Glory Club. We're trying to do those once a quarter, where we pick some topic and have a bunch of streams on it throughout the day. Um, so really recommend that to you. It's all about Texas, which has like its own story, literally its own story at one point, separate from the rest of the United States. It was literally an independent country for 10 years, and the citizens of that country were called Texians. So, anyway, the streams cover the Texas War of Independence and the Battle of the Alamo and Texas and migration and all kinds of stuff like that. Texas is an unusual and important place for various reasons, as we discuss on those streams. Okay, bringing on Mr. Ryan Turnipseed. Hello, sir.
Hello, Stephen. How are you?
Doing okay. All right. So glad to have some folks with us with a late start. Thank you. Um,
Well, right before we start, it might be
yeah,
worth pulling other people into Alamo Day. And I'm not just saying this because it's the stream that I did, but you'll find a
yeah.
few migration stories, immigration stories, demographic change stories that look sort of like a microcosm of the current United States. So, uh,
Mm-hmm.
if at the very least, just for that one story, people may find the whole day interesting. Hopefully, that can get you hooked into the rest of the absolutely great content that we put out.
All right. Thank you. Um, okay. I think we'll just get going. Let's see. I'm going to save that article for later. So we're going to finish up today with a book that has absolutely gripped me, I have to say. Um, it's Brian Burrow, Days of Rage. That's primarily what we've been drawing from, what we'll draw from today. And as I mentioned before, I just want to hawk the book a little because we're just basically pulling straight from his great research. And he read everything else, including um, did a lot of reading and also did interviews of some of the key figures in the book who were still alive and were willing to talk on the record with him. Um, and it's just amazing. And the story it tells has hit home for me because it's stuff that was going on essentially through the first, well, it goes up to like 85. So, like, the first 16 years of my life is when all this stuff is happening. And I'm basically unaware of it until I read this book, to be blunt. I didn't really know any of this stuff. I have learned this reading the book and going through it with you guys on the show. This is how I've learned about like my own history, or the history of what was going on when I was a kid in my country. Which at the time, as he mentions, right, Ryan, he'll say, this was featured in the newspaper for a couple days, or a debate was raging in the New York Times. I mean, if you were not like me and a kid and maybe paying attention, you might have remembered some of this stuff being in the papers at least now and again, right? Um,
Right, and it doesn't really help though that there would be like a major bombing or something like that, and they'd be like, "Yeah, this was in the paper for 2 days," and it was
right.
promptly forgotten.
Yeah, yeah. Even at the time, it doesn't get much attention. Doesn't get the kind of attention you might think it would. Um, Partially because of repetition. They just did a lot of bombings, and so it became a boring story, believe it or not. You know.
We bombed our way into having bombings be a boring story. That's
Yeah.
that's remarkable.
Yeah. Yikes. Um, okay, so I think the marketing for this one is, well, I don't know, it's not terrible. I titled this one "The Women Terrorists." Thanks once again to our wonderful graphic designer for a great thumbnail. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Um, Highlighting the role of the women in this last part of the story. They're not the only actors, as you'll see, but they are sort of the through line for the last bit. Now, if you actually look at the book or read the book, you'll know that we're doing something a little bit funny. We're not finishing with the final chapter. We're actually finishing with the 3 chapters before the final chapter, because the final chapter was wrapped up the story of Ray Levasseur, right?
There you go. Yeah,
Yeah,
Lavasser.
Ray Levasseur and the United Freedom Front. Um, and I just want to tell all that as one episode. So we already covered that last chapter. So this is actually chapters 20 through 22, which is about a group that just never really adopted an official name. I guess they just became called the Family. Okay, isn't that heartwarming? Well, we'll see what you think. Okay, so our story starts about 1977, and I'll just read to set the mood here. I'll read the first paragraph of chapter 20, which is called The Family, the Pan Radical Alliance, 1977 to 1979. By 1977, the age of the urban guerrilla appeared all but over. The SLA, Symbionese Liberation Army, was a dim memory. Patty Hearst, now languishing in prison. The Weather Underground was no more. Only the FALN, that's the Puerto Rican Independence terrorist outfit, the NWLF, and the little noticed bombing groups in New England and Washington state soldiered on. Not that anyone in middle America much cared about the odd midnight explosion in Seattle or Boston, or especially New York City. This was 1977. New York was a ruin. Things were always blowing up in New York. And as he goes on to explain, there's also a lot of fires in New York, which we'll mention in a moment. Which, by the way, Ryan, there's some kind of economic analysis that could be done there. I mean, I think he hints at it, but I feel like there's a little article from Mises.org to write, like, why did the South Bronx get burned down by the people who own the buildings
Yeah, yeah.
in the 70s, you know? Anyway, we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so let's see. Mark Rudd was a key figure in the Weather, one of the key leadership of the Weather Underground. He surrendered in September of 1977. Jimmy Carter was taking office about this time. Wait a second, that doesn't sound right. Jimmy Carter was, oh yeah, took office in
76 to 80.
early 77, right? So he would have been
Yeah, yeah.
elected in 76. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So early 77, Jimmy Carter's taking office, just to set the time here. So what happened is there was the townhouse when the Weather blew themselves up in the early 70s. The Black Liberation Army was defeated. The Symbionese Liberation Army, and he calls it their immolation. They were literally just burned to death in a firefight, in a gun battle with police. And so you'd think would all be over, but our story sadly continues for 8 more years.
He makes the point here. You think they would have gotten the hint that there wasn't going to be some armed revolution at the slightest bit of violence, but people still have the idea that the ideology is true, and that if they just, light the right spark, everyone will rise up, and we will get the new left
Yeah.
utopia in the United States eventually.
Yeah, we mentioned it before, but when he does some of his later, right at the end of the book, he's sharing some of the interviews and just asking people, was it worth it? What did you guys accomplish? What do you, reflect back on what you did and what happened. And they pretty consistently say, well, we just kind of missed the mood of the people. We were the vanguard and we needed the people to be like with us. If they had been ready, then basically what we did would have made sense. And we just misjudged it and they weren't ready. So they don't really say we did something wrong. They just said our timing was off. Okay. Well, it strikes me, Ryan, that this sounds like their own little version of populist delusion, right? Because the people being ready, as far as we can tell, studying political change, has almost nothing to do with it.
Right, yeah. They completely minimize the role of their leadership and just think that the people themselves are already there, despite absolutely not being. They think that they have the leadership that will just spring up into like this wildfire revolution. It's not there. They think
Right.
that there's going to be some like drawn out revolutionary civil war. That's not going to happen because no one's ready for it. No one wants it.
Yeah.
They are really drawing upon the will of the people. And I have a
Hmm.
feeling the reason that they are just saying, they missed the mark or the feeling just wasn't there instead of saying we were total failures, they can probably see a lot of their goals that they wanted back in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. have partially been achieved by
Mm-hmm.
political leaders in the modern day. You know,
Right.
they can probably see some of this, and I would not shock me if they wrongly attribute it to, well, we started this with the armed revolution that just didn't take off, but you can see the slow momentum was really there. Uh,
Yeah. Right.
yeah,
Right.
it would not
Um,
shock me just because they don't really seem to learn this key point.
right. So, uh, there remained in 77 a ragged core of armed radicals who refused to surrender their dreams. By the way, I think Ryan Burrow, for my taste, Ryan, does a pretty good job. Like, we're going to do this Smithsonian article near the end of the stream where it's really embarrassing. It's more typical where they're kind of like, oh yeah, these guys were terrorists, but their ideals were wonderful, and they were ahead of their time, and you kind of get more of that. He actually is pretty good, I think, in this book. He mostly just tells the story. He does tell you their motivations, how they were seeing things, so you can kind of understand like why were they doing what they were doing. But he doesn't spin the book like apologizing for them and paying tribute to their ideals or something like that. I didn't pick up hardly any of that. He's pretty objective
Yeah,
and neutral, you know.
it could definitely be much worse if this was written in 2023, but I would probably be saying about here's why these people should have succeeded and why they were, the next coming of Christ, each and every one of them.
Yeah, right, right, right. Brian Burrow came from a happier time, uh, a more civilized age. I mean, the book isn't that old. I think what is it, 20? Let's see, 2015. Yeah, but you're thinking
Yeah,
eight
yeah.
8 years is a long time in regards to this stuff. Um,
Yep.
uh, okay, so what did you say? Oh yeah, so some of these had been with some had been with weather. A few on the margins of the Black Liberation Army. Some of these ones who were left. Unlikely revolutionary incubator one could imagine. An acupuncture clinic. It was called Lincoln Detox. Okay, so that's our intro to what we're gonna the setting where this all begins. I'm gonna skip around a bit. Jump in if I skip over a detail you think is key, Ryan. First of all, that arson epidemic. That is just crazy. The early 1970s, by the early 1970s, arson in the South Bronx had risen to epidemic proportions. By the end of the 70s, more than 40% of all the structures in the South Bronx had burned. Now, I don't totally get this, but it says that the Bronx had been the middle class Jewish borough of New York for decades until the 50s. Factories began closing, Jewish families fled before a rushing tide of Puerto Ricans and African Americans. So this was sort of like white flight of a sort, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And it went from two-thirds white in 1950 to two-thirds black and Hispanic in 1960. So that's an amazing change over 10 years. Massive transition there, right? Let me just
Right.
acknowledge Prince of Parma. Good to know you're here, sir. Welcome. Glad to catch this live in the States, he says. Keep up the good work. Thanks for your support, man. Let's see. Yeah, property values plummeted. Landlords couldn't find buyers. So scores of the landlords resorted to stripping the property and then burning them for the insurance money. So some kind of perverse incentives resulted in 40% of the South Bronx being burned down by the late 70s. So that was a cheery place. It says out of control fires blazed every night for years, creating a perpetual haze over much of the borough. Firefighters couldn't keep up. Entire blocks went up in smoke. Again, Ryan, I just wanted to mention this, not because it's sort of the context, the background, the setting of what happens here, but it's a little bit separate from this left-wing terrorism thing, right? But again, I never heard about this. A major borough had like half of it burned down. Major borough, one of the main 5 boroughs of New York, one of the large ones, had half of its buildings burned down in the 70s. What the heck? How do you not hear? How do you not know these things? I lived in
Well,
Manhattan.
I have a feeling why it might not be publicized, because you're directly talking about, land values falling after a demographic
Right, right.
transition, and the only way you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
get money off of it is insurance claims. So, I mean, that's
yeah.
a
Right.
that's a pretty spicy fact I didn't think would be included in this book.
And then I think I shared this before, but watching flames spread near Yankee Stadium during the 1977 World Series Howard Cosell famously quipped, "The Bronx is burning." Okay, so anyway, things got pretty crazy. Drugs, gangs, etc. In the Bronx. They had this hospital, Lincoln Hospital, which was had become just a mess. The locals called it the butcher shop, and so the hospital could not handle people who had drug addictions who were coming for help, and so they started what became the South Bronx's largest drug treatment center, and everyone called it Lincoln Detox. Okay. Here's where it meshes with our story. What does all this have to do with our story? Well, here it is. Run by radicals who established a socialist collective to administer it, as you do with your drug treatment centers, right? Lincoln Detox drew many of its volunteers and paid staffers from the ranks of New York's militant leftists. The walls were adorned with photos of Che Guevara, Malcolm X, and eventually Joanne Chesimard, from earlier in our story, and coming up soon too, by the way. The volunteers at this place included Michael Kedaweo Tabor and Afeni Shakur of the Panther 21, right? The 21 who were put on trial and became a big cause celebre. Brian Flanagan from the Weather Underground, as well as Bernadine Dorn's sister Jennifer Dorn. She fell for a young Lords leader. I didn't mention that. The young Lords were ones who were pushing for change and pushed for a Puerto Rican gang or something, and pushed for some of this. Part of what they did result in this drug treatment center. Anyway, she fell for a young Lords leader, Mickey Melendez, with whom she had 3 children. Lincoln Detox, in short, became a kind of clubhouse for New York's radical elite. This is so bizarre. So according to Deruba Moore, going back in our story a little bit, when the Black Liberation Army needed medical supplies in 1971, the radicals at Lincoln turned them over by the truckload. So Lincoln Detox did offer detox services, the importance of armed revolution, all that sort of stuff, right? But here's where it gets even crazier. The treatment they offered was truly radical, Brian Bro says, in every sense of the word. So they believed, in a theory popularized by Malcolm X, that the plague of drugs was a scheme concocted by a white government to oppress blacks. And I think I've heard things like this before, Ryan. And it's also reminding me, I think there was a thing about how AIDS was started by the CIA to kill the blacks.
The drug narrative, because it basically just gets pushed in schools now, is kind of like, oh, they don't put this in the history books, but here's what they really said from teachers that come straight out of college. The narrative goes that Nixon, Reagan, the big Republican leaders used the various intelligence agencies of the United States to flood black neighborhoods with various different drugs in order to whatever the narrative has to go. Every president.
Yeah, got it. So just a typical, a standard attack when they don't like somebody. You're pushing drugs on our kids or whatever.
They're pushing drugs on the blacks or the minorities or whatever the protected group is. They don't care about kids.
Oh, sorry. Sorry to have implied that. So Malcolm X, what was his theory about how to deal with drug addiction? He had his own answer to the 12-step program, right? And that was one step, right? There's only one step in the Malcolm X recovery program, and it goes like this. Blacks can be cured of their drug addiction by freeing them of the self-hatred indoctrinated in them by whites. So if they don't hate themselves like whites have taught them to do, then they can get off the drugs, right? So how do they operationalize this at Lincoln Detox? They had methadone to help. That's a help for heroin addicts, I believe. And along with that, they had a regimen of political education classes that included Marxist literature and lectures. All this was paid for, by the way, by New York City. Like, there's a whole bunch of crazy stuff we're going to share here. It's all getting paid for by New York City funds, government funds.
makes you wonder what they're doing in the modern day with the funding in every single omnibus bill, or
Commu-
on the local level without the omnibus bills.
Community organizers, Ryan. They're gonna lift up our communities. Um, anyway, uh, so every addict, for example, was given an 86-page pamphlet called "The Opium Trail: Heroin and Imperialism," which claimed that a commitment to armed revolution could cure heroin addiction better than methadone alone. This is amazing. Um, I mean, it's amazing, Ryan, the more you learn about how much the left have been in places of influence over impressionable people, in this case,
Yeah,
other addicts, also children. It's amazing that Antifa hasn't been more sort of front and center for a longer time, because basically they're indoctrinating all these people, impressionable people, that, the right thing to do is go out and burn and destroy and,
yeah.
bring Whitey
If
down
I
and,
could if I could offer an analysis, I think I would say that formalizing a group called Antifa with the various different blocks that exist of it was probably a major misstep on the left's part,
mm,
because now there is a group that is its very identity at its core is anti-fascism, and it runs around and breaks things. You can't just break it on, oh, that's just the BLA. They're disconnected from the NWLF, and they're disconnected from the new
mm,
left as a whole, and that's disconnected from the Democratic Party or whatever. You can't. Whenever you like formalize, yeah, these are the anti-fascists. They all vote for these groups. They espouse these things on social media. They leave these public trails. I think it's a massive misstep that and it's definitely been a boon to us to be
yeah,
able to point to these people. So,
yeah,
back when they were doing this, when it was, oh yeah, we run a place for addicts to rid themselves of drugs, and we're not going to tell you this, or maybe we are, and you're just going to go along with it. We're going to have it be a Marxist indoctrination camp. That would be much more difficult to stamp out on a wide scale if it was under the same organization, kind of like it is now, give or take.
hmm,
Like it's very public, all the different affiliations now. When it was sort of decentralized, at least on the surface, this stuff was
right,
much more
yeah,
dangerous.
right,
It's much worse today, but less difficult to dismantle, if you will.
yeah, right. If anyone was ever in a position to do such a thing. Anyway, Matula Shakur comes into our story now, who will play a big role. Um, he was one of the volunteers at Lincoln Detox, and he was a young black radical, right? So he's a political guy. His orientation is political, and he's like, oh, great, I'll help people get off drugs and teach them about Marxism. Um, let's see, his as a teenager, he had joined one of the edgiest of early Black Power movements, the Republic of North Africa, the RNA, and Africa spelled with a K for some reason. Um, and they had proposed in 1968 carving out a new black homeland from the states of Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. To be fair, I've seen some of those like maps of where American blacks are, and that is a lot of the places where the populations are concentrated, right?
Right, yeah, it's a basically the Republic of New Africa is a weird secessionist movement where they basically this is the side of the black identitarian movement that basically just said, well, we can't go back to Africa, so we
Hmm.
kind of have to stay here. And the solution is to force every white out of the states of Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina and keep it for ourselves. That's the only way that this could end in some sort of amicable way, which
Right.
is a bit strange because that would take a massive amount of violence to cleanse those states of the of its white influence. But
Right.
this is the '60s. I don't think we're quite thinking too terribly direct or non-maliciously.
Um, let's see. I'm gonna get his name wrong. Matulu. Matulu gained status at Lincoln Detox, especially after marrying one of the Panther 21, Afeni Shakur, making him stepfather to her son, the future rapper Tupac Shakur. So there you go. And then they found that revolutionary politics wasn't actually working very well as a cure for heroin addiction. Imagine that. And then here's a connection to right-wing politics that I did not see coming when I was reading this. I was like, what? Who? In 74, acupuncture was introduced to them by a young doctor named Richard Taft. His uncle was Robert A. Taft Jr., Republican senator from Ohio. And if I remember correctly, Ryan, Senator Robert Taft was a much admired figure. I'm hoping I'm thinking of the right Taft.
On the
I
old
think
right. On
there's
the
more
old
than
right,
one.
yes.
On the old right, yeah.
He will get branded an isolationist in the modern day. We have a
Yeah.
historian in our circles that would lambaste me for claiming so myself, but you and I would recognize him as an anti-internationalist, and he was one of the last figures of the old right that had any
Yeah.
sort of claws and teeth.
Right. So anyway, strange little connection to Senator Taft. Um, so he taught them about acupuncture until his dead body was found in a clinic closet in October 1974. And he had died of a heroin overdose. So I don't know if his treatments. Anyway, that didn't stop them, by the way. The fact that he died of a heroin overdose didn't discourage them from going with his approach to addiction.
And this is an interesting thing because in like the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, you see a lot of these old political dynasties where they're progenies of like the third generation or whatnot, or cousins or nephews or whatever, die from drug overdoses and leave behind no children. I think that happened to a branch of the Bismarcks in Germany, where one of their youngest or younger branches went to university. I want to say in the north of Germany or something like that, and it was drug fueled, had little to no children, if at all, and then that line went extinct. This just happens, which kind of might show holding on to political power through so many generations or prestige or social acclaim has a sort of degenerating effect.
Right.
And this happens with a lot of American political dynasties as well. You hear a lot of stories about those presidents that come out of old political dynasties that they apparently had a very drug drug happy college days. Usually, is what the stories that you'll hear. So,
right.
It's a theme. If anyone wants to go read into it.
Okay, so Matula Shakur goes and studies acupuncture so he can become a doctor of acupuncture or whatever. And then he turns to, at the age of 26, budding doctor of acupuncture, he turns to armed robbery. As you do when you're a 1970s left-wing radical. As we've been learning, right? A lot of armed robbery. So his salary working at the clinic didn't go very far. And he still saw himself as an ardent black nationalist and revolutionary. And that was what was filling the air at Lincoln Detox. So he said he wanted to raise money to give back to the poor blacks of the Bronx. What he didn't say, and not everybody realized for a while, even those working with him on this stuff, was that he wanted more money to fuel his growing appetite for a newly popular drug, cocaine. And so his salary wasn't buying much cocaine, and he needed more money to come in, right? And then I have to reintroduce one more figure. Sekou Odinga comes back to the U.S. He's wanted, one of the Panthers who's wanted. And he had been in Algeria with Eldridge Cleaver, but he decides to come back. Just to mention Odinga, he was admired. Let's see, who called him this? He was one of Cleaver's principal bodyguards. Oh yeah, one visitor to Algiers says Sekou is the most amazing of all the Panthers. He drew comparisons to Shaft and other blaxploitation heroes of the day. The word used most often was badass. So anyway, he decides to come back to do revolutionary action, even though he's a wanted man. So he got to New York, And then there was the shootout in which Joanne Chesimard, Asada Shakur, was captured in May 1973, and he had just met with her. And then this is going back to our BLA episode. Final BLA member Twyman Myers was killed November 1973. Odinga realized he was on his own. He was ready to, go into action with those people, and they were all getting arrested and killed and stuff. So they started their, this phrase still makes me laugh. I think it's okay that he left it in just because it's so laughable. They started their revolutionary expropriations, which is what they call stealing, in about 1974 after the BLA's collapse. And he actually, by the way, it's clear from this that he was one of the ones interviewed for the book. There's a lot of quotes directly from him remembering what was going on. He says, I couldn't even tell you how many banks they robbed. At least 10 before 1976, Connecticut, New Jersey, mostly New York. I remember expros, that's short for expropriations, if you don't know your radical lingo. I remember expros in Midtown Manhattan, Long Island, Queens. I went back in twice to one in Queens. When the guard looked up and saw me for a second time, he just made this face and went, oh no, not again. This group, where they were initially doing robberies, fell apart in 1976 after his main partner decided to retire. And then he renewed his acquaintance with Matula Shakur at the Lincoln Detox, right? Matula Shakur looked up to Odinga and wanted him to work with him on robbing banks. Odinga had been, he had opened a legitimate business. He was kind of like having a little bit of a life,
Legitimate business is always such a funny word in these contexts. You
Yeah.
hear it in mafia movies and all that. I run a legitimate business.
I'm a legitimate businessman. Odinga, it was interesting, was really skeptical about Matula Shakur. He said Matula was a good speaker, a good organizer, and that's what he's cut out to do. The military stuff, that wouldn't work out. So Shakur tried to do a first robbery attempt in late 1976, and Odinga didn't want to be involved. So December 6, 1976, a new underground group came into being, and they didn't have a name or anything yet, and they were going to go hold up a bank robbery. It didn't go well. One of the guys would have back spasms, and he got another. He was running and had a back spasm and fell because of that. Anyway, I'm not going to go through that, but it was crazy. But then they did get about $13,800 October 19th of 1977. I'm sorry, they did a successful one in May 77, October 77. And it says at that point, not much about their crimes was revolutionary. They weren't making communiques like, this is why we did this or whatever. They weren't giving any money to the poor. And the FBI didn't know they existed. They were just stick-up men, as far as anyone could tell. What changed it? This is where the women come in. I had to get there eventually here. Ready? What transformed Matula Shakur's motley crew of mock revolutionaries from a collection of armed robbers happy to hold up a house of weenies into hardcore felons destined to commit the most outlandish crimes of the era was its incorporation of a small band of white radicals, all fleeing the wreckage of Weathermen and affiliated groups, all still ferociously committed to carrying out the struggle, and all but a handful, as it happened, women. So a key figure here is Sylvia Beraldini. She had been on the Panther 21 Defense Committee, the Asada Shakur Defense Committee. She was a leadership position in the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee, which was that front group that the Weather formed for a little while. She forced its split in late 1976. She co-founded a new group, the May 19th Communist Organization. And that's going to be the thread that will follow through here for this episode. First of all, you need to know why they called it May 19th. That's because May 19th is the birthday of both Ho Chi Minh and Malcolm X. So it's sort of paying tribute to Black and Third World leaders that they admire, left-wing leaders they admire, right? And at this point, I need to, I'm probably going to start bringing this in. At Academic Agent's recommendation, I listened to an episode of Bronze Age Perverts show, Caribbean Rhythms, and the episode is 118, if I remember correctly. It's called GNC. And I'll use the more polite way of talking about what he is talking about, just call it international race communism. And in that episode, which fit in so nicely with what we're doing here, he explained that what we're seeing in this series, where they're in the Days of Rage, where these sometimes Black, but often, white, Jewish, college educated people like this, their big motivation, right, is not so much class. They will talk about that sometimes, as racial type stuff, right? The oppressed are not the oppressed because they're white workers. You don't see a lot of time spent with any. There's not a lot of talk about white workers in this whole book that I recall, which there would have been 100 years before in left-wing radical circles, right? They're oppressed because they're minorities, because they're third world, because they're Black people, things like that. That is now the focus of these people we've been following. Well, what BAP argues in 118 is that is the focus of the U.S. State Department and much foreign policy and intelligence agency activity throughout the post-World War II period. And he gives many concrete examples of this. It's really mind-blowing. You have to pay for it, but if you go to Gumroad and look for Caribbean Rhythms, you can find his podcast, and episode 118 meshes so nicely with this, because instead of, they were, the people we've been talking about in this book, they were not directly connected, as far as we know, to, having intelligence agency backing or something like that, right? State Department backing. Like modern color revolutionaries, who probably do. But anyway, they weren't so much connected to that sort of thing, but they were in perfect alignment in terms of mission. It's decolonization is one of the big through themes that BAP talks about with the post-World War II U.S. State acting abroad. They tend to support often left-wing radical leaders.
And this was if you think back to the BLA episode when we were talking about Cleaver and the Black Panthers in exile over in Algeria, this was a theme that I brought up because we supported basically every anti-colonial group in Africa after, I don't know, the late 50s. I don't think we supported the ones in Kenya, but I could be wrong on that even. But Algeria. I am fairly certain we supported the independence faction against the French, just because that's what we did throughout all of the rest of the French and British empires, is we supported whatever group went against them. The supposed public reason for that being that we needed to we were basically being criticized by the Soviet Union for being imperialist despite standing against it and our founding principles and all this other stuff. So Eisenhower and all the other GOP, like very good conservatives, bought right into the communist frame, and they supported all these different, left-wing anti-colonial groups, despite the fact that they were completely against our allies. This is why we supported Egypt in the Suez Canal crisis. Despite the fact that Egypt never really sided with us at all and only ever went to the Soviets for anything good. We did this, that whole thing plays out in many other places. But when you get to Algeria, that is partly our work. And they're over there housing groups of radical revolutionaries that want to completely destroy and dismantle the United States and would end up butchering dozens of people in order to get that to happen. It's amazing. Everything that we do, especially in our latest iteration of foreign policy, just comes back to bite us in ways that we couldn't even write up in a fiction novel.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm not trying to say is that this was all one vast conspiracy with the Symbionese Liberation Army effectively, all reporting to the same boss that, you know, some CIA backed left wing guy in the third world was reporting to, or something like that. But I do find it quite interesting that while they would see themselves and proclaim themselves as against the US empire, they actually were doing the same thing that the US empire was doing. They had the same aims, they had the same framing, um, uh, the decolonization, um, opposing Europe in favor of the third world and minorities and stuff like that. The what that reveals is that that was the U.S. empire's framing throughout the post World War II period, and hasn't stopped. I would say, um, to this day, uh, and that was the framing of everybody in our book, right? Because as we discussed right at the beginning, Weather Underground was not motivated by anti-war per se, which is probably what a lot of people think. They said from the beginning they were inspired by the Panthers. They were motivated by Black liberation. So that's what all of these things are about. So it's just reminding Ryan a little bit of the pushing at an open door thing, that these
Right.
people who put themselves forward as amazing rebels who are standing against the great power end up to be in complete alignment with the power. Right.
Yeah, and that's been every successful cultural movement for the last 70 years. It's
Yeah, right.
they're the great revolutionaries pushing for exactly what, the intelligence agencies want. Yeah,
Right.
good victory, guys.
Okay, so where were we? Sylvia Berardini. Okay, so May 19th began as a handful of women, no more than 15 by Berardini's estimate, most of them living in Brooklyn. There were the ex Weathermen, Judy Clark and Susan Rosenberg. Um, let's see. Oh, and they said after the split of the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee, we went back to New York and we were kind of lost. We had never led organizations before. We were the rank and file. We had never done this. It took time to regroup. Um, what a marvelous illustration there, Ryan, of the whole populist delusion point, right? And they're literally like, we were sheep without a shepherd. We didn't know what to do. You know, um,
Yeah.
basically they found a shepherd. That's where we go next. Um, so let's see. Beraldini starts doing some things from Matula Shakur. She says it started out, she was friends with him. It started out with him asking me for small favors. I rented cars for him. I gave him money. They were little things, nothing really illegal. I perceived it as helping a friend. But then everything changed in one night in December 1977. Um, so until that point, Beraldini and the women of the May 19th Communist Organization, from now on I'll just call it May 19th, while committed to fighting racism and police brutality, they really hadn't done much. And that night there was a Kwanzaa party in someone's Brooklyn apartment. But the true agenda that night revolved around a renowned radical that the May 19th women had until recently known only by reputation, Marilyn Buck, famous in underground circles as the only white member of the Black Liberation Army. Um, she had been convicted in 1973 in a California federal court of illegally purchasing ammunition for the BLA. Okay. She had emerged from the Student for Democratic Society's University of Texas chapter. Again, a lot of college educated people get involved with this. Strange how that happens. Anyway,
I
well,
wonder if they lost their positions at their universities or were kicked out for their illegal activity.
yeah. While like-minded peers joined Weatherman, she headed instead to San Francisco, where she fell in with the Black Panthers and later the BLA. To hardcore militants who snickered at toilet bombers like Bernardine Dorn, Buck was the genuine item, brave, resourceful, and utterly committed to the cause. Marilyn was the queen, recalls Elizabeth Fink, who was at that party that night. She was the white girl of the BLA. So the court had sentenced her to 10 years and sent her to a federal women's prison in West Virginia. But in 1977, having served 4 of those years, she got a furlough and she went to New York where she hung out with her lawyer, Susan Tipograph, a key name, and befriended Beraldini. By the night of the Kwanzaa party, word had spread through the radical women of May 19th that Buck had no intention of returning to prison. And so Marilyn said she wasn't going back. She needed protection. So some of the May 19th women said they agreed to protect her. This was the first time any of us supported someone underground. That meant money, apartments, ID. They did everything for Marilyn Buck because she obviously had to hide at this point because she was supposed to go back to prison. So this was a very big deal. It was taking the step into the unknown, the point of no return. And she says it was one of the biggest mistakes we made. It eventually put the FBI onto us. She had only had 18 months left in her sentence, but we couldn't say no. This was Marilyn Buck. We couldn't say no. So Buck wanted to not go back to prison, but that wasn't all. She wanted to rejoin the underground. She wanted to go back to terrorism. They arranged an introduction to a man they all idolized, Sekou Odinga, the badass guy, right? And so these two met at a hotel in Washington, D.C. They talked for a couple hours, and she said she wanted to be involved. Yeah, this is worth sharing because of this theme of that it's all about Black people, the third world, stuff like that. She says, she gave me her history, Odinga says, the things she had done for the BLA, her understanding of the struggle, especially the African struggle. I kind of grilled her. I probably treated her unfairly. Her thing was, use me as you see fit. I was pleased with her answers. She passed. So you have Beraldini and Buck, these two white women, Odinga and Matula Shakur, these Black men, and they feel like they can work together and be effective. And here's why. Because now they had something the Black Liberation Alliance didn't have, an above ground support network. Remember, with the Weather Underground, they had people who would let them stay at their homes, would send them money. They had lawyers who would jump in if needed. Father-son stream, it says. Right? The myth continues. Okay. Anyway, I shouldn't say myth. I hold the term myth in high honor. So the misinformation continues. Okay. Anyway, so they had an above ground support network, and this kind of cracks me up. They called it the White Edge. So they had an edge over other terrorist groups. That is, they had white people working with them. Okay. The group had no official name. Unofficially, they began calling it the Family. So, in the early months of 78, So yeah, now he's going to jump over and let's see, do we need to cover any of that? It's about the FALN, which is going to be important in a minute, but yeah, oh, here we go. What happened is that the main bomb maker of the FALN, this Puerto Rican independence outfit, was Willie Morales. And I'm going to have to go into detail here because this is the part that I mentioned in the live chat is Madeline says literally stealing my dad. This is the part that is just unbelievable. I mean, I'm just sitting there like trying to picture some of the things this man did. So we got to go through this. Okay, so he's making bombs for the FALN. The FALN, by the way, haven't emphasized it much in this series, but they actually did more bombings than anybody. They just did a tremendous amount of bombing, mostly courtesy of Willie Morales, who made a lot of bombs. But one day, it didn't go well. For one thing, he had never gone underground, by the way. He held down a job, and as far as anyone knew, he wasn't sought by police. They had no idea that he was a key figure here. Oh, and by the way, just a little detail. It says every bomb he made was exactly like its counterpart in a manual that he used. Every single one detonated when the big hand on a wristwatch struck 9, just like the bombs Ron Fliegelman built for the Weather Underground. So the Weather Underground does end up having an influence. People are literally copying their bomb design, right? And so he's working on bombs, and as he's screwing the metal cap onto the last bomb, it exploded in his hands. Now, sorry, the detail gets a little bit graphic here, but it's really key to understand how just insane what happens with this day, and also later with when the family gets involved. The blast blew off most of Morales's hands, sending his severed fingers zinging madly through the apartment. The metal cap he was holding rocketed into his chin, fracturing his jaw in at least 5 places, knocking out a number of teeth, ripping off his lips, and destroying his left eye. His face was a bloody mess. Then he went unconscious, but then he woke up, realized he was still alive, and he did several amazing things. And I do try to be very careful in this series not to speak positively about left-wing terrorists. So I don't know what to say here, but this is just nuts here. 9 of his fingers were blown off. Only his left thumb remained intact. He had dreadful burns across his face. Still, he had the strength and presence of mind to gather an armload of FAON documents, which he somehow lugged into the bathroom, and flushed down the toilet. The bathroom door closed behind him, and he had to fight to reopen it, as evidenced by the bloody stump marks he left on it. So he couldn't even like operate door handles, right? Not easily. Then he sealed up the apartment, went to the gas stove, blew out its pilot lights, and cranked the gas up to high, apparently twisting the knob with what remained of his mouth. I guess they gathered that from blood on the knob and everything. And then he sat there figuring, if I'm going to go out, by the way, the explosion had, I didn't mention that, the explosion was very loud. The boom could be heard up and down the street. I didn't read that. Anyway, so the police are on their way. He gets this all set up, and he figures, I'm going to die, but I'll take like a dozen cops with me, right? Well, the firefighters come in, they use an axe to crash through the door, and nothing blows up, and they arrest him. All right. And I won't go on much more about that except for this bizarre detail. His trials always had people like yelling, supporting him and yelling at the judge, and all kinds of crazy stuff went on. But this was one of the craziest. In January 1979, Morales's attorneys filed their most unusual challenge. In a lawsuit, they alleged that police had illegally confiscated his severed fingers. The police had taken the fingers as evidence, right? The fingerprints, right? To tie him to the bombs he'd made. Morales complained that they should have been sewed back on. Well, okay. Anyway. So then, let's see what happened. The Lincoln detox. I don't know if I want to go. Oh, well, okay. They basically had everybody cowed who should have been. This is like literally a city being paid for by the city, and no one can control them. It said they were increasingly operated as an independent entity, unanswerable to any authority. So they didn't control them, nor did they stop giving them money. And they would just intimidate people. They stormed the HHC. What is that? Human Healthcare or something like that. Anyway, the agency, one of the agencies providing the money, they stormed it, smashed furniture, and then after that, everybody was reluctant. Everybody at the HHC was reluctant to confront the clinic. Sorry, I just reading that, Ryan, I just had to think, if there were like a right-wing radical group that had taken over some state-funded thing, and when the people funding it said, hey, you're not doing what you're supposed to do, you're just doing a bunch of right-wing politics, they came to those people who were kind of trying to call them to account and like ran around their building and yelled and shouted and smashed up furniture. I don't think they would have just been like, oh, well, I guess there's just nothing you can do.
It might have turned into, say, a siege with various forms of government outside, holding everyone up in the facility.
Right, exactly. Having said that, a fellow named Ed, is it pronounced Koch or Koch? Koch, I think. Ed Koch.
I pronounce it Coke.
Koch. Yeah, I
but
think that's right.
who knows?
So, new mayor in January 1978, the feisty Ed Koch, he was sick and tired of radicals abusing city resources. I'm assuming Lincoln Detox was not the only situation like this. There were other left wing radicals just basically living off the New York dime. So, anyway, he said to the New York Times, hospitals are for sick people, not thugs. Detox officials, the mayor recalled years later, ran it like Che Guevara was their patron saint with his pictures all over the wall. It wasn't a hospital, it was a radical cell. Ed Koch was, in fact, entirely right about this, more right than he could have known at the time. So anyway, they fought back and forth, but Koch smashed Lincoln Detox and fired everybody and cleared it out. And that was the end of that. And so they had to pick up their bank robbing, pick up the pace of their bank robbing. And it was then that Shakur's White Edge, Marilyn Buck, and Sylvia Beraldini began to play significant roles in the group's bank robberies. And Beraldini didn't even realize that's what they were helping them do at first. She says, when you showed you were willing to go to the next level, the requests never stopped. What help you could give, you gave it. It was hard to say no. For me, the eureka moment, that is when she realized what they were actually doing with this help, was one day Matulu said, you need to be at a certain corner. You open the trunk and put us in and drive away. I don't remember the corner, the car, or even the year. I was scared shitless, but I did it. That was when I realized that this was not just renting cars. This was when I realized what he was doing. So they'd been robbing banks for months, and she's finally tuning in that she's an accessory to this, right? That didn't stop them, though. She says, it was around this point that she asked her May 19th comrades, Judy Clark and Susan Rosenberg, to help out. Both agreed. First, we did very precise. Okay, now there are some people in my audience who are going to snigger at this point, but let me finish before you snigger, okay? First, we did very precise things that were useful, and we did them because we were white. Beraldini continues. Cars, research. The most important thing was ID. We could buy the special cameras necessary to make it. We could do that with ease, and we did. A white girl like me does that, no one looks twice. But a black man, right? So 35 years later, asked why she joined Shakur and Odinga in their bank robberies. Beraldini folds her hands and heaves a deep sigh. So this is from one of the author's interviews, right? We had developed a whole political vision of the U.S., how change would come to the U.S., that this involved the blacks getting their own nation. We thought we were helping people to promote that vision. It's unrealistic, yes, but we believed it. Also, I felt we were rectifying a long history of white people using black people in the U.S., going back to the Civil War. I'm a little confused by that statement. What about the part before the Civil War? But anyway, we really thought we were redressing that in some way. That was very important to us, too. There was also a question of resources. They were going to use the money to help the black community, and they did. Or at least I thought they did. Elizabeth Fink says, sounds crazy, right? Let me tell you, it was crazy then, too. These people, Judy and Sylvia, they were driven crazy by their commitment to the blacks. It was like a cult. The question was, how crazy could you be? So at first, only Marilyn Buck, who was the more wild of the women, took part in the actual robberies. And he details some robberies. In one, they got $200,000 in cash. Some of these robberies, by the way, some of this money, wouldn't be a bad amount of money these days. And this is 1978 and 1979 and 1980 and so forth. So some of these figures are like, oh, wow, they actually made off with some serious dough in some of these. 200,000 is one of the smaller ones that we're going to hear about. So they got the $200,000. It went very smoothly. Marilyn Buck did what she was supposed to do very well. She drove the getaway van. The family was ready for bigger things. Marilyn Buck, having spent time in prison herself, had a special affinity for those behind bars. That fall, she drew up a list of underground figures they might help escape. At the top of the list was none other than Willie Morales, who went on trial in a Queens courtroom in early 1979. Um, and so now comes the jailbreaks. And again, this is where it gets like, how? Uh, so,
So right before
go
we
ahead.
move
Yeah,
on, that
please.
$200,000 in today's money would be upwards of $800,000 in cash.
Yeah, give him a little pocket change to buy some
Yeah,
guns and stuff, right?
could probably take over a small country with that amount of money.
Maybe not. I don't know about that, but yeah, pretty useful. Thank you. Okay, so now here it is, the first jailbreak. Even today, more than 35 years later, no one outside the FALN or the family knows precisely how they did it or even who took part. But they planned for weeks, and they are pretty sure it was spearheaded by Marilyn Buck, Sekou Odinga, and the FALN, who wanted their man out, right? Sylvia Berardini wouldn't discuss details, even decades later, right? But she confirmed she received a formal request for aid from the FALN. We were asked to do this one aspect, to bring in the tools. We were white and women, so of course we could do this on our own, and we did. Possibly strongly suspected that radical attorney Susan Tipograph was involved. She represented Marilyn Buck and also Willie Morales, so she knew both these people, right? But she was never charged, and she's always denied any involvement. But we're pretty sure it was her anyway. Okay. So May 1979, he was being held in a third floor prison ward at Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan. Somehow he came into possession around that time, after a visit of hers. His attorney came into possession of a 14-inch pair of wire cutters. Over the next 2 nights, Morales, working only with the stumps of his hands, used the wire cutters to clip through the wire of the metal grate that covered his cell window. On May 21st, the officer took him to the toilet, brought him back. At some point after that, he finished cutting a 1-foot square hole in his window grate. Then he raised the window and punched out its screen. And then, here it is. There were some people down below. They had a ladder, but the ladder didn't quite reach up high enough. Morales unfurled a 10-foot-long flesh-colored bandage, tied one end to his bed, tossed the other end out into the cool night air. It didn't make it to the ladder, but it was the best he could do. He wriggled through the hole he had cut. Then, and this was the part that flummoxed everyone afterward, including me right now, the man with no fingers used the bandage as a rope to lower himself down the side of the building. I can't even picture how he's doing this.
I can't either, so don't worry.
He had wet the bandage to strengthen it, but nevertheless, in a matter of moments, it snapped. Their guess, based on various physical evidence, he fell about 20 feet onto a window-mounted air conditioning unit, which showed a sizable dent. And then he landed on the grass below, leaving 2 deep footprints in the turf. No one saw anything. The supervisors of the officer who'd led him to the toilet said that he slept through the entire thing. So he slid into a waiting car and off he went. This was a big deal. Official New York was thunderstruck by the brazen escape. Handless terrorist escapes, proclaimed the Post headline. How on earth had a one-eyed man with no hands managed to cut his way out of a cell and shimmy down the side of a building? How had he gotten the wire cutters? Why hadn't anyone noticed? Anyway.
It sounds like the setup to a bad joke.
Yeah.
A handless, one-eyed man sneaks out of a prison.
Right. So that was that jailbreak, and he went off, disappeared off, and I don't know that he's going to come up again, so I'll just mention that he eventually was spotted in Mexico City. Many years later, they wanted to grab him, and he had 5 bodyguards. There was a fight. There was a gunfight. All of his bodyguards got killed. One of the police got killed. U.S. wanted to extradite him for his crimes. As you might remember, at a restaurant, people had died because of one of his bombs. Um, and Mexico wouldn't hand him over. So we believe he ended up in Cuba. So anyway, that's the Willie Morales story. Moving on with the May 16th and the family, May 19th and the family folks, they started planning their next jailbreak. And this time they wanted to go after, free a woman they all admired. She had personified the black struggle and had been behind bars now for 6 long years. Assata Shakur, better known as the heart and soul of the Black Liberation Army, Joanne Chesimard. So let's see. They did a holdup. Kathy Bowden. I'll just pronounce her name Bowden. It's Boudin. Kathy Bowden was involved with this one. She'd worked with the weathermen. She was one of the one-time weathermen. She had been in the townhouse that blew up. She was one of the ones that survived it and just quietly walked away. So she's involved with the robbery. They get little minor robbery, $105,000 in 1979 dollars. And then let's see, they detail one. Oh yeah, so this was Sekou Odinga helping Chesimard get out. Yeah, it said maybe they had been lovers. When he's talking to him years later, he says he doesn't deny a suggestion that they had once been lovers. I loved her, let's put it that way, he says quietly. She was one of our heroes. So Chesimard herself sent the idea of the escape, and Odinga drove to the prison. And even though he was wanted himself, right, he had snuck back into the U.S., he just walked in and visited her. Anyway, they checked out this facility in New Jersey. It was kind of a pastoral setting, green hills and all this. And he's like, I think we could do this. Let's see, is this... Odinga says more in recent times, Maragella, one of their radicals they would read, used to say a good revolutionary has to be audacious. If you think it can be done, given the right circumstances, you can probably do it. She thought it could be done. I thought so too, for the simple reason that it was clear the authorities weren't thinking of it at all, which made me think of September 11th, which supposedly their success was in part because just no one saw that coming. So the people on the plane were just, in fact, the protocol at the time was that if someone tries to take over a plane, you don't resist, and they probably just want to hijack the plane and land it in Cuba or something, and better to just live, Now I think if someone tries to take a plane over in the United States, people would think, well, we're going to die anyway. We're not going to let him kill other people
Yeah,
too.
you eliminate the guy.
Yeah, right. But sort of no one was thinking of it, and so they were audacious on 9/11, right? So he's same kind of thinking here. November 2nd, 1979, they get her out. I don't think I'll go through the details, but they get her out, and let's see. Yeah, it says in barely 10 minutes, without attracting the notice of a single outside guard, the family had rescued the most notorious female revolutionary of the decade. Chesimard would live in Pittsburgh. They hide her out in Pittsburgh for 9 months until August 1980, when, according to later court testimony, she boarded a plane that landed in the Bahamas, from where she eventually made her way to the safety of Fidel Castro's Cuba. Odingo says Mexico was probably the more likely. But anyway, the escape was front page news across the country. The FBI had no idea who might be involved. Sketches were drawn up of 4 suspects. A series of apartments were raided. The FBI found nothing. So they did 2 bold, audacious jailbreaks and completely pulled them off, making use of their white edges. Okay, so let's see. FALN. Oh, yeah. Brief thing about the FALN. Just mentioned that they planted a bomb in the New York City campaign headquarters of the Republican presidential candidate George Bush. This is March 15th, 1980. Let's see. Oh no, they held it up. Sorry, they didn't plant a bomb. They held it up. And then Oscar Lopez of the FALN, a three-person team, burst into the two-story Illinois headquarters of the Carter-Mondale campaign. And they wanted to get the list of delegates so that they could send them messages. Oh yeah, they were upset that Puerto Rico might become a state because they saw that as moving away from their wish for Puerto Rico to be independent. If it becomes a state, it's going to be that much harder for it to break away, right? Yeah, Lady of Shalott says, Assata Shakur lives in Cuba to this day. She is a polarizing figure as she never did anything to help those who were in prison for aiding her escape. Meaning she doesn't even talk about them. I saw somebody complaining about that. Okay, then let's see here.
Kind of admire the inherent reasoning behind the FALN. Puerto Rico can't become a state because the last time states tried to leave the Union, they were absolutely obliterated.
That's a good point. Let's see. I'm going to skip it, but basically, FALN. They had someone else died because of them, Alex McMillan, the FALN's sixth innocent victim. They left a bomb and in a bathroom, and somebody was looking at it, and it blew up in his face, and he died. Okay, let's see. All right, now let's wrap up the family story. So, the 1980s began 6 weeks after the jailbreak of Joanne Chesmard, Assata Shakur, and it says what remained of the armed struggle movement was so obscure no one suspected that Matula Shakur and the family even existed. They had managed to free Chesmard and Willie Morales without leaving a clue, at least none the FBI could find. But the family had a problem. He says, when something pollutes a radical cell's intellectual purity, whether it is allegations of sexism or racism, as happened with Weather, leftists call it a corruption. The family had been deeply corrupted from the outset by a familiar scourge, illegal drugs, mainly cocaine, as we previously mentioned. Matula Shakur was a heavy user, and they had other hangers-on who were as well. It says cocaine corrupted the family at every turn. Sekou Odinga considered drug use counter-revolutionary, so Shakur tried to keep it secret from him. But you know, it was hard to hide. And the women did not understand what was going on. This is going to sound laughable to us, but especially coming out of the 60s with all the drug use. But the drug use they were familiar with, I think, was more like tripping on acid and marijuana and stuff, right? That's kind of what I associate with the hippie days and stuff. And this was a little bit different. It says the white women, the true revolutionaries, knew nothing of Matula Shakur's drug problem. Not Marilyn Beck, Sylvia Beraldini, Judy Clark, Susan Rosenberg, or Kathy Bowden. To a woman, they believed they were supporting the second coming of the Black Liberation Army. I knew nothing about drugs, nothing, Beraldini recalls. I just thought Matula and those guys were hyper, energetic, and they never slept. And I kept thinking, why are they so pumped up and excited all the time? I thought they were just on like a high metabolism. I didn't know. So they're working with this guy for over a year before they realize what's going on there. So let's see. They held up had some failures, but in 1980, by the way, we're in the 80s now with this craziness, as we already mentioned in the episode about the bombs, diapers. No, wait, I'm sorry.
The
Not
UFF, the United
UFF.
Freedom Front.
Yeah, United Freedom Front episode.
You had it right. Yeah, bombs and diapers.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. That episode. Yeah, bombs, banks, and diapers. Okay, so they held up a truck and got $529,000. Okay. Let's see. I wasn't going to go through every one of these here. Oh yeah, and then he spends more time on the FBI. The author has a whole book about that's more focused on the FBI. So he spends a little more time on this than I've emphasized in this series. But this, I'll just share this because I think you'll find this interesting. So Mark Felt, who we later found out was Deep Throat, and someone else, they got another FBI man. They got oh yeah, Felt got a $5,000 fine. They didn't get sentenced, and $3,500 for Edward Miller because of the shenanigans the FBI had been doing trying to catch the left-wing radicals, right? COINTELPRO, that type of stuff. Then
So,
Bernadine Dorn turns herself in, Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, and she gets a $1,500 fine. And it says the excruciating irony that Bernadine Dorn, the most wanted underground figure of the era, could walk away virtually scot-free just weeks after two of her top FBI pursuers had been convicted of crimes against her was not lost on anyone involved. The Weather Underground had done like 100 bombings, and she was never prosecuted for one of them, recalls Lou Veazey, the FALN investigator. That's amazing. I mean, absolutely amazing. You know who got prosecuted? Us, the FBI. I think it's interesting because it's telling of where the priorities of the regime were. But anyway, go ahead.
yeah, and you can also sort of see like a breakdown here where they aren't perfectly unified. I don't think the people on the FBI liked these people getting off for like a fine when they had been bombing places and people for you know almost a decade at this point, if not more. Um, the other thing that I had earlier, just before people forget about it, that $529,000 robbery is equivalent to $1,920,000 in the modern day.
You'd think they could get something done besides buying cocaine with that, you know? That's a good chunk of change. Um, and it gets bigger. We'll get to it. Okay, so yeah, so he said the author says one reaction to discussion of radical violence during the 70s and early 80s is that much of it was harmless, save for Francis Tavern. That's where the FALN ended up. Their bomb ended up killing quite a few people. The policemen assassinated by the Black Liberation Alliance and the SLA themselves getting killed. Not that many people died. But as the underground dwindled, its remaining members grew increasingly desperate and dangerous. The single deadliest year for radical violence in the US, I think he means, was in fact 1981, 11 years after the townhouse explosion, after the Weather blew themselves up in 70 in the townhouse. 7 people died, including Alex McMillan at the FALN attack at JFK Airport. And most of them died because of the family. So yeah, he talks about all the tensions in there, but let's see what happened. Yeah. So yeah, they were getting increasingly, the family was getting increasing appetite for violence, and eventually it was somebody was going to get hurt, and that's what happened on Tuesday, June 2nd, 1981, outside of Chase Manhattan Branch in the northern reaches of the Bronx. They were going to hold up an armored car. Yeah, so they the two couriers, the two guys in the car, armored car, they hold a shotgun up on them and tells them to freeze. And they did so, and then lie on the pavement. And then this guy's a real live wire, and I'm sorry, he's only showing his last name right here. Oh, Tyrone. I don't know how to say this. Rison. Rison, I'll say. I have no idea. Tyrone Rison. So in the car, he's trying to get up to where they are. He's got an M16, Rison. He's momentarily unable to open his door because a parked car had blocked it. Shakur inched the car forward, allowing him to get out, and he was frustrated by that, so he's screaming and cursing. Emerging into the parking lot, Rison glanced at the two prone Brinks couriers and just opened fire, raking both men with bullets. One would survive, and the other died. And it says William Maroney was the one that died. He was 59. the murder of William Maroney was a turning point for the family because now they drew the attention of the New York Police Department, which launched a full-scale investigation. Bronx Detective Division, Major Case Squad, all that stuff. Okay, so let's see what I want to jump to. Okay, then jumping forward, October 20th, 1981, they are holding up a Brinks truck, and there's 3 guys there. Yeah, and again, things are getting crazier, in part because of drugs. Let's see what happened. Yeah, so the Brinks guards are walking out with bulging bags of cash to their truck. Just as they reach the back of the armored truck, the family's van screeches to a halt beside the truck. 3 men in ski masks leap out of the back, and he says maybe it was the cocaine coursing through their veins, maybe the frustration of waiting all these months to do another holdup. But this time the family shouted no warnings and took no prisoners. They just opened fire. So one of the guys died right away. They got away with $1.6 million in cash in 1981. Getting that right? Jeez. That's a lot of change. And it shares these 3 were about to retire or be done working together or whatever, and it says that one of the guys who James Kelly, I think, yeah, he had not been shot or anything. It says he had been knocked out. He came to, staggered into the back of the Brinks truck. And stepping out of the back, he cradled Trombino's head as a group of bystanders ran up, asking what they could do. Over and over and over, Kelly kept saying, "They shot my friends. They shot my friends. They shot my friends." Little detail, by the way, Trombino recovered from his wounds, though he never fully regained the use of his left hand, and he remained a Brinks guard for 20 more years until September 11th, 2001. He was making a pickup in the basement of the World Trade Center when it was attacked by terrorists on September 11, 2001. And he died there at age 68. So, lots of terrorism. Okay, so let's see. Then, and then the final bit for the family, which is that, again, they're holding up a truck. Which one is this? Oh no, I think they're getting away from the Brinks truck thing. They're trying to get away. And Odinga thought this was nuts, and he didn't participate. He thought it was nuts, this job, because it left them, they had to take the highway, so it was just going to be really easy to cut off the roads and get them. And that's basically what happened. David Gilbert and Kathy Bowden, who were together, married or whatever, it says, they believed they were aiding a black revolutionary army. They were risking their lives for that one simple, foolish belief. And they were in front of the U-Haul, and the police stopped them, and they tried to kind of be cool and deal with it. But one of the detectives felt like something was up. The others were like putting their guns away and cooling off. But Detective Keenan stepped to the back of the U-Haul. He said, yanked the rear door and it was locked. And he said, "I want to know what's in there." A moment later, the door burst open. The entrance ramp erupted in gunfire as 5 black men, all armed, leaped out and opened fire. They hit Keenan. They hit a policeman named Waverly Brown. When he fell to the pavement screaming for help, another gunman walked up and fired into his chest. And then Sergeant O'Grady was hit by 3 M16 rounds. Let's see. I lost track somehow in this section because it says, 3 men dead. Yeah, 3 men dead and 3 others were wounded by all this. And I'm trying to remember who got away. A lot of them did not get away. Gilbert was arrested. Some of these people spent many, many years in prison. Yeah, so anyway, everyone else got away. Behind them, Matullah Shakur's cocaine-fueled gunmen had left 3 men dead and 3 others wounded. And they continued to catch more of them. A guy named Sundiata was shot in the head and killed. Kuwasi Balagoon was arrested peacefully in January 82. Sylvia Beraldini was arrested in November outside her Manhattan apartment. Okay, so now I'd like to go to, let's hope this is set up right. Yeah, so that was not the end, believe it or not. He doesn't cover it very well in the book, but in this picture, we have two pictures here. On the left, we have a bombing of the U.S. Capitol's North Wing by the May 19th group in 1983. And on the right is a picture of the core members of M19, Alan Berkman, Tim Blunk, Susan Rosenberg, Linda Sue Evans, Marilyn Buck, and Laura Whitehorn. Let's see, what do I want to share from this? We already told you about May 19th, why they called it that. Yeah, so this is of interest because it's an incredible outlier from male-led terrorist organizations, because it ended up being mostly women and led by women. And he wrote a book about it called Tonight We Bombed the Capitol.
What a strong stride for women's liberation. We have finally got our first major women's terrorist group that can bomb the Capitol too, just like the men.
Yeah, and well, for one, I just want to note that this is yet another bombing of the Capitol, which I'm losing track how many times the Capitol was bombed before the only thing that ever really mattered at the Capitol. But anyway, oh, that's funny. Look at the date. I didn't notice this. The date on this article is January 6th, but it's January 6th, 2020. Anyway, that's funny. Okay. Yeah, this article is a little
sympathetic.
Are they celebrating these people, these terrorists? Or are they condemning them? It's a little hard to tell.
It's a bit weird because it's the Smithsonian Magazine. You'd expect them to not be celebrating the Capitol being attacked, but
right, exactly, yeah. This is, I should have mentioned that. It's from the Smithsonian Magazine. Article is by Lila Thulin, however you say that. So this book, Tonight We Bombed the Capitol, is the story of a group of essentially middle-class, well-educated white people who made a journey from anti-war and civil rights protests to terrorism. Let's see. He mentions that in 78, after forming in 78, they escalated from picketing and poster making to robbing armored trucks and abetting prison breaks with the Matullah Shakur and those guys, right? And he mentions that they helped spring explosive builder William Morales and BLA organizer Assata Shakur from their prisons. And then they turned to building explosives themselves. Just before 11 p.m. on November 7th, 1983, they called the U.S. Capitol switchboard and warned them to evacuate the building. 10 minutes later, a bomb detonated in the building's north wing, harming no one but blasting a 15-foot gash in a wall and causing $1 million in damage. Over the course of 20 months in 1983 and 84, they bombed an FBI office, the Israeli Aircraft Industries Building, the South African consulate in New York, DC's Fort McNair, and Navy Yard twice. They would call to clear the area, have an explosion, and then a pre-recorded message to media railing against U.S. imperialism or the war machine under various organizational aliases. They didn't present themselves they didn't use the name May 19th. The pictures you see on the screen are Susan Rosenberg on the left and Linda Sue Evans on the right. So let's see. So Linda Sue Evans, for example, her politics took a radical turn while attending Michigan State in the midst of the Vietnam War. Many of
Many
their
such
members,
cases.
yeah, many of their members' stories were like that. College activism at schools including Cornell, Berkeley, Radcliffe, and Hampshire College shaped their far left worldviews. And this is interesting, the way that this article puts this. And for some, their status as out lesbians put them at odds with a heteronormative patriarchal society. I feel like that's a bit of a giveaway by the author of her perspective on life. But anyway, let's see. Yep. Give some of their background. Alan Berkman was one of the few men in the inner circle. He had been involved with the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. Tim Blunk is pictured here after time spent in Rikers Island. Oh yeah, Blunk married Silvia Beraldini to help her obtain U.S. citizenship. Today, Blunk is a florist in New Jersey. We'll get to what happened to all these people that didn't get killed in the middle of all this. Yeah, they were not stopped until 1985. So we started the story in the late 70s. This continued until 1985, even after this Brinks incident in, let's see, 81. The women continued for another several years bombing stuff. Let's see. So I wanted to share a little bit from the Smithsonian article of all places. They interviewed the author, and let's see. Yeah, okay, and he explains how they saw themselves. This is fits really into the stuff I was sharing from BAP. Okay, so there, May 19th, sort of an offshoot of the Weather Underground, which essentially cracked up in the mid 80s. That's not quite right. It was before that, but anyway, mid 70s, I think he means. These women decided to continue the armed struggle. Many of them had been in the Weather Underground, but they thought the Weather Underground had made important ideological mistakes. That the Weather Underground saw itself as a vanguard of revolution, when in fact the real revolutions were going on in the Third World, or in the United States itself, in places like Puerto Rico or among Native Americans. So notice their orientation is towards like minority and third world type stuff, right?
Yeah, it's the new left narrative.
Yeah. The real revolutionaries were these third world freedom fighters, and it should be the job of North American anti-imperialists, as they called themselves, to support those liberation movements in whatever way they could. So if that meant bombing the Navy to protest the role of the United States in Central America in the early 80s, they would do that. If it meant attacking the South African consulate in New York that represented the apartheid regime, which they did in September 1984, they would do that. So they really saw themselves as being supporters and followers of these third world struggles in the Middle East, in Southern Africa, and in this hemisphere particularly. They talked about themselves as being in the belly of the beast, being at the center of this imperialist monster. So they had a particular responsibility in their view to carry out actions to bring this monster to heel. And like I said, what's so ironic about all this is, as BAP explained, this is this decolonization that they were worried about or whatever. This is what the U.S. government was running around doing, military agencies and the State Department and stuff like that. And to this day, I think the color revolutions and things like this, it's all about destroying, I guess, European power in favor of third world power because it helps the U.S., I guess. I don't know what the logic is. Or just because they're all commies. I don't know. So let's see. I'm going to skip over that. This picture here on the screen is, it says to maintain secrecy, M19 members wore disguises like this red wig and made calls from payphones. This image shows Linda Sue Evans under FBI surveillance in Baltimore in May of 1985. The FBI tracked M19 members living there down by monitoring calls to a music store where Evans had dropped off a guitar. He says, they asked him, what surprised you? He said, towards the tail end of their life cycle as a group, they started to debate quite intensely, assassinating police officers, prosecutors, military officers. This would be to return to the Symbionese Liberation Army, right? Which did assassinate police officers. none of their bombings killed anyone, but they did think about it. They had a huge inventory of weapons, dynamite, detonation cord, Uzi machine guns, fully automatic with sawed-off barrels. They had incredible arsenals. Um, he says it seemed like they were preparing to go bigger, but it just didn't happen. Um, let's see. Yeah, okay, I got to read this. It makes me want to vomit in my mouth. But anyway, they ask, M19 is unique in being a woman-founded and led terrorist organization. Did that influence its objectives or shape it in any particularly distinguishing way? They certainly were much more feminist and pro-woman than the Weather Underground, which was notoriously misogynistic. They were acutely conscious of any kind of sexism within themselves. The liberation of women, gay people, racial minorities was much more at the forefront for them than groups like the Weather Underground. It's important to realize they didn't really believe in so-called bourgeois feminism, National Organization for Women, equal pay, all that stuff. Yeah, that was all nice, but they considered that a distraction. Women's liberation would actually come with political revolution. Yeah, so I just reading that, Ryan, the liberation of women, gay people, racial minorities. I mean, this is our regime right now.
Do you remember Carl Benjamin's old weekly roundup, This Week in Stupid and all that,
This
where
Week
he
in
would
Stupid.
go over the most sort of dumb things that were put out by respected institutions and all this other stuff, or non-respected institutions if it was idiotic enough. This reminds me of something that would be on that. Oh yeah, we have M19 being unique for the first woman-founded and led terrorist organization. They were fighting for real women's liberation, not equal pay, not all this other bourgeois feminism stuff. They wanted political revolution. I can hear him lambasting this like 5
Yeah,
years ago.
yeah,
If only,
absolutely.
yeah, if this was the thing being discussed back then. This is hilarious.
It's amazing. I mean, pushing at an open door, right? As AA puts it so well. Okay, and then this is going to get a little spicy here, but then the article takes an amazing turn. Even though this is an article supposedly about these terrible left-wing terrorists, it now frames, it now switches to horrible right-wingers. Okay, he says, the interviewer says, you write, despite claims by Fox News and others that Antifa activists are terrorists, their street brawling and harassment of right-wing extremists hardly rise to the level of the left-wing political violence of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The same cannot be said about the neo-Nazi and white supremacist violence. So ending that quote from him, she asks, could you talk about the parallels, or lack thereof, between the left-wing terrorism you write about and some of the domestic terrorism we're seeing today? So, okay, already Antifa is being framed as like, well, could be worse. It could be like,
They're
bombing the
called
Capitol,
activists.
right? What'd you say?
Yeah, they're called activists by this person.
Oh, let's see. Antifa
But Antifa
activists.
activists
Yeah.
are terrorists, in quotes. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
or scare
sure,
quotes
buddy.
terrorists. Yeah. Right. They're not terrorists. Yeah. Oh boy. So here's his response. The white supremacists today are not obviously as structured. You do have coherent groups like Adam Waffen Division, an extremely dangerous right-wing extremist group. But one of the things they share is that ideology is extremely important to them. They have I wouldn't call it a coherent worldview, but they have some very well-defined ideological notions about how the world works. That's very similar to May 19th and the far left extremist groups of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, that they're not crazy. I don't know what he means by that. But anyway, what they want you to walk away from this is, wow, there were some girl bosses back in the 70s or back in the 80s, opposed to things that every right-thinking person should oppose, like, apartheid South Africa and stuff like that. But really what we got to worry about now is not like Antifa burning things down. I mean, this is January 6, 2020 that this is being written, right? Oh, I'm sorry. To be fair, that's before summer of 2020 is when we really get the really open Antifa terrorism, right?
It's before the Passion of Floyd, and it's also before the great year zero of January 6, 2021. But
right.
there's a comment in the chat that is echoing my sentiments perfectly, and they corrected us or I should say, the author saying that the Atomwaffen division is a very dangerous right wing group. They have corrected it, and they've said an extremely dangerous federal operation.
um, yeah, I just have been given some information to help me fill in details about Atomwaffen because I know nothing about that. So I'll trust our commenter on that for the moment. Okay, but yeah, so you would think in an article about May 19th, they would leave you with a sense of, the extremity of the terrorism back then. But instead, they find a way to leave you, worried about right wingers and not Antifa, who, several months later, was about to show itself as being quite dangerous. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to share. Yeah, well, let me finish this. So systemic terrorism. This is the lesson to draw from this, Ryan. Not that commies blew up like thousands of bombs in the 70s and 80s and so forth, and held up things and shot people and all that stuff. Here's the real lesson to learn. Systemic terrorism has been a deep, deep part of our history. After the Civil War, it's not just the Ku Klux Klan, but outright insurgency against Republicans in southern states by white militias and white supremacists. One of the things I'm trying to bring forth in the book is this notion, to quote Black nationalist leader H. Rap Brown, violence is as American as cherry pie. Terrorism is not an exception, a one-off, a random thing. It is deeply ingrained in our politics and society and history. So there you go, Ryan. The commies aren't the problem. It's just, they were just kind of being Americans, really, when it comes down to it. Got it?
I absolutely hate that because you hear about all the violence being justified by the rights of Englishmen and not for violence's sake. And then you get to like modern day lefties and they throw out the whole rights of Englishmen because that's both racist and antiquated because, you're talking about rights and Englishmen. Both of those are bad categories now. And then you get to the modern day, what do you have left? Oh, it's just the violence that was done in defense of those things. Well, that's the American part. And obviously they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing here, as usual. It's not like they're being dumb or they overlooked this. And you can obviously tell that because they will not apply this both ways. They will put up the federal operation known as Atomwaffen as the evil right wingers that are potentially very violent, and violence is bad. And then also there are black nationalists that may have grenaded a few cop cars. But violence is American. It's nothing to be worried about.
Right.
It's like every leftist weapon tool, weapon word, I guess you could call it. Violence is simultaneously really, really bad and really American, which is a good thing to be applauded. And that's where they will get you.
Yeah.
That's where the conservatives usually go wrong, is because they will buy into one or the other or reject it outright. The way that you win this is you don't deal with it, you just ignore it and then continue on being normal.
All right. Okay, so I just wanted to hit the epilogue because this is wrapping up our coverage of Days of Rage by Brian Burrow. Highly recommended book. As much as time as we've spent on it, I've left out a ton of detail. It's just amazing, and I can't believe this happened in my life, and I didn't even know it was going on. Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that because somebody addresses that in the epilogue, movingly, I think. So he starts the epilogue by talking about November 2010. 200 people gathered at the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Center in Harlem for a memorial service celebrating the life of Marilyn Bach. She had died of cancer that summer, just a month after being released from federal prison. She had served 25 years. So she's in prison from 1985 when they caught the last of this women terrorist group until 2010, and then they let her out in time to die of cancer. So who was there? Kathy Wilkerson from The Weather, her attorney Elizabeth Fink, Ray Levasseur, Kathy Bowden, BLA attorney Robert Boyle, Levasseur's old comrade Kazi Touré, and they all these old friends rose up to praise Bach as a poet, a friend, a comrade. They read aloud a letter from Sekou Odinga. He says, amazingly, in more than an hour, no one said the words bombing or bank robbery or murder once. Linda Evans, the one-time weatherman, who was arrested with Buck in 85, a member of the May 19th group. She jogged down the aisle, as did two of the FALN women, friends from prison. This is interesting. Two people got sick of it. Kathy Wilkerson and Elizabeth Fink rose to leave. "This is just too much," she muttered. "This is ridiculous." And Fink said, "The movement is dying and no one here seems to know it. These people are just deluded. This is crazy." And so he says, in terms of tangible successes, of hard-won political or moral victories, the short answer to assess what they did, the 1970s era underground, was not much. And when he asks the veterans that were still alive, almost all are hard-pressed to point to any lasting impact the underground had on American society, short of metal detectors and bomb-sniffing dogs. It was all a mistake, Sekou Adinga admits today. People weren't ready. This is the thing I was referring to earlier. People weren't ready for armed struggle. One of the things we now know, and should have known then, is we were way out in front of the people. A little more study would have made that clear. You can be a vanguard in the struggle, but you have to have the people behind you, and they weren't. So, in other words, poor timing is essentially what Mr. Adinga is saying.
Yeah,
right?
the people, the will of the people was there, just not, it wasn't matured yet or something like
Right.
that. And
Yeah.
uh,
Wasn't
our
time
good
yet.
author of the book, our good author of the book here has a very fantastic analogy. And he says,
Go
looking
ahead.
back across a chasm of 40 years, those who pursued armed struggle might be best compared to the German werewolf guerrillas who briefly attempted to resist Allied forces at the end of World War II, or to those Japanese infantrymen who emerged dazed from Pacific Island caves decades after the war's end, not realizing that the fighting had stopped years before. So I kind of disagree with this because, like I've been saying throughout this, they kind of got half of what they wanted, if not more, from just the way the political elites were taking the country. But then it's also very true that was not achieved at all by armed struggle. So
Yeah.
these people that they're just like scrounging up from like the 80s, basically, it is like finding someone from like the civil rights era that's still talking about the evil injustices of Jim Crow and all this other stuff. They
Right.
talk about
Right.
it in the same way today. They just aren't using it as a pretext for Marxist revolution. It's hilarious.
Yeah. Let's see. So what we're going to go through what happened to some of these people. Bill Ayers from the Weather Movement. He remains perhaps the most visible veteran of the underground struggle. He's an active author and lecturer. At bookstores and shopping malls, young activists line up to get him to sign their books. Ray Levasseur, who has completed his own memoir, Riley notes that articles he publishes on the internet receive exponentially more exposure than any of the communiques he issued after his many bombings. So, what is this telling us, Ryan? They get more attention than ever now. So, did they lose?
And here's the other thing as well. Like he's just out there in the open admitting, yeah, I bomb places, but like this online blog that I have is getting way more attention. You can say that in public?
Yeah,
Really? Like I'm trying to imagine like AA or Charlie or Clausington saying something like that had they ever even engaged in illegal activity.
right.
Like my God. Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure that we would just be able to say that. I'm sure we aren't living under a new left pseudo totalitarian regime.
Okay, so he asked, I wanted to share some of people's reflections on all of this to wrap up our series on Days of Rage. So he talks to Kathy Wilkerson. He asked, I think he asked like all of them at one point or another. I don't know that he shares all of their responses, but he asked them like, what do you think of what you guys did? So what matters most about the underground, people like Kathy Wilkerson insist, is simply that it existed, that it demonstrated the lengths to which passionate Americans would go to confront what are now viewed correctly as Richard Nixon's corrupt government, an unjust war, and rampant racism at large in America. 3 years after talking with her in that Brooklyn diner with her grandson, I asked Wilkerson what the underground had achieved. In an email, this is what she said. Listen to the language of this. Listen to how easily these nut jobs from the 70s sound like right now, sound like something you could turn on the TV and hear. For the hundreds, if not thousands, of whites who engaged in some form of armed resistance, it mattered that we chose to step out of the encasing, protective cover of privilege. class, and or race, and take equal risk with those who had no choice but to fight for a better future. Few, if any, would argue we had some advanced insight into the mechanisms of political change. But still, many still take strength from the fact that we chose to identify with the victims of oppression. And in that commonness, to wrestle with questions of social change of some more beneficial course in relation to each other and to our planet. I mean, forget, take away who said it and ignore her background, which they probably just would. And they could just put this out right now. I mean, this could come from Biden or something,
It could come from a college management class for all you know.
What?
It could come from like a college management class when they're talking about their biases and how you need to know these things to effectively lead a
Oh,
group. It could come from like
right.
a humanities department.
HR. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Do you know what she says? The good German metaphor hung over us. What happens if one doesn't pay attention? Do you know the reference there?
I don't. I'm going to take a wild guess. It has something to do with World War II, but I
Boomer
could be
truth.
wrong. Yeah,
I
I
think
could be
right.
wrong.
I'll keep going, but
keep going.
If you can find it, that'd be great. Yeah, well, I won't go on, but again, it's exploitation.
Here we go.
Oh, go ahead.
I found it. Yeah, okay. Good Germans is an ironic term, usually placed between single quotes, such as good Germans, with single quotes on either side, referring to German citizens during and after World War II who claimed not to support the Nazi regime, but remained silent and did not resist in any meaningful way.
Got it.
How did I know?
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, so she says, she goes on to say, Kathy Wilkerson, those with privilege really do not hear or see. The oppressed ask, what does it take to be listened to? So those with privilege really do not hear or see. What do they call it? Unconscious bias. We get unconscious bias training now. I don't know if you knew that, Ryan.
Yeah, I definitely know.
In the corporate world, yeah.
I'm in a business school. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh right. They're gonna expose you to all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Here's another view on what happened back then. He says there are other observers, however, who argue persuasively that the crimes the underground committed overwhelm any altruistic motivations. This is what the left always gets, right, Ryan? Right, Ryan, and that's what I said this series was going to be about. We're going to talk about their crimes, and we're not going to spend any time giving them credit for dreaming of utopia or whatever the crap, right? We're just
mostly because some of the dreams of utopia are themselves evil. So
yeah, most of them. So the most insistent advocate of this view, a view that is unsympathetic to these left-wing terrorists, is a 49-year-old New Jersey banker and writer named Joseph Connor, whose father, Frank, was one of those killed at Francis Tavern in 1975. In recent years, Connor has launched what amounts to a one-man crusade to counter those who might applaud any aspect of the underground's legacy. He testified against Oscar Lopez's parole, appeared on Fox News to call Bill Ayers a punk, and pressured the City College of New York to back off student-generated plans to name a building after Assata Shakur and Willie Morales. Connor's campaign began that afternoon in January 1975 when, having just turned 9 years old, he was waiting for his father to come home early to celebrate his birthday. I remember my mom was making a meal, he says today. It ended up being served to mourners at the funeral. That is a heartbreaking detail. Ever since, he has marveled at efforts to portray certain underground figures as anything other than murderers. These people, the Weathermen, the FALN, they were deluded, self-motivated, egotistical. What's the word I'm looking for? People who just think of themselves and nobody else. It was all about them. This really makes me think of the boomer that, like what the Vox Day talks about, the Pharaoh and AA just talked about on Cigar Stream yesterday, right? Just completely narcissistic. They knew better than everybody else. You think of them as kids, and they were young for the most part, misguided youth, but they were murderers. Murderers first, revolutionaries second. They appointed themselves my father's judge, jury, and executioner. He represented something they didn't like, so they decided they had the right to kill him and others. And let me continue with this moving perspective from Joseph Connor. What truly drives them mental, Connor goes on, is the notion that modern terrorism on U.S. soil dates only as far back as the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. That gets me every time, he says. To think that America thinks none of this ever happened, that it's not even remembered. It's astounding to me. I mean, it makes me think of how January 6th is like the first attack on the Capitol, as far as most people know, right? You know, I blame the media. The media was more than happy to let all this go. These were not the kinds of terrorists the liberal media wanted us to remember, because they share a lot of the same values. They were terrorists. They were just the wrong brand. My father was murdered by the wrong politics, by leftists, so they were let off the hook. That's what we're left with today. A soft view of these people when they were as hardened as anybody. They were just terrorists, flat out terrorists. Bravo to Mr. Connor for his accurate perspective. So, what happened to these people? He says they've gone on to live lives as disparate as their backgrounds. Many who escaped prosecution re-entered conventional society, embarking on belated careers as doctors, lawyers, and especially educators. Go back to the first message in the chat from my friend. Of those who were prosecuted, a dozen or so remain in prison, some more than 40 years after their crimes, like Matula Shakur, Judy Clark, David Gilbert, Oscar Lopez, Ray Levasseur partners Tom Manning and Jan Lehman, Herman Bell and Anthony Bottom, convicted in the murders of Waverly Brown and Joseph Piagentini. Sekou Odinga was paroled in November 2014. Let's see, I'm going to skip forward a bit. So, what happened to some of these people? Susan Rosenberg received a 58-year sentence related to possession of explosives. She was granted clemency by President Clinton in 2001. It's not the last time Clinton's going to come up. Kathy Bowden was paroled from Bedford Hills in 2003. Today, after an appointment that drew criticism from the New York tabloids, she is an adjunct professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work. Marilyn Buck. Yeah, well, it mentions their 8 bombings between 1983 and 1985. November 7th, 1983 bombing of the U.S. Senate. We just went over that. All drew lengthy sentences. Let's see. Levasseur drew a 45-year sentence. After 20 years, a full 13 of which were spent in solitary confinement. It's pretty brutal. He was paroled in 2004. Active in efforts to free underground figures who remain in prison, he turned 70 in 2016. I think he's still alive. I found pictures of him. Let's see. Oh yeah, then the shootout about Morales, I covered that. 18 members of the FALN served lengthy prison sentences for their roles in the group's 2 bombing campaigns. In the mid-1990s, a clemency campaign drew the support of former President Jimmy Carter and 10 Nobel laureates. In 1999, with his wife Hillary seeking the support of Hispanic voters for a senatorial campaign in New York, President Bill Clinton offered clemency to 16 of those imprisoned. All but 2 accepted. Both the House and the Senate passed measures condemning Clinton's action. But he was the president, so let's see. Of all those who went underground during the 70s, few have gone on to more productive lives than alumni of the Weather Underground. Other than those who became involved with Matula Shakur, only Kathy Wilkerson served prison time, all of 11 months, on explosive charges related to the townhouse. Most resumed more or less normal lives. Wilkerson remains a math instructor in the New York schools. She lives in Brooklyn with her longtime partner, the radical attorney Susan Tippegraph. Ron Fliegelman worked as a special ed teacher in the New York schools for 25 years. Mark Rudd is a retired community college teacher in Albuquerque and gives talks about the 60s. Howard Machtinger lives in North Carolina, where he's worked as a high school teacher and at the University of North Carolina, who remains active in education reform efforts. Russell Neufeld practices law in Manhattan. Robbie Roth taught social studies at Mission High School in San Francisco. Do you feel like your social studies teacher might have been a left-wing radical and just was never outed? Um,
Do you think your social studies teacher was part of a terrorist group in the 1960s and 70s? If so, call this number.
um, Several Weather alumni have risen to respected positions in their professions, with very few knowing what they did in the 1970s. And he goes on to talk about them, some of whom he doesn't name their names because they never were outed. Bernadine Dorn has been a clinical associate professor of law at Northwestern University for more than 20 years. She has been active in efforts to reform the Chicago public schools and in international human rights activities. She has never disavowed her years as a weatherman. Let's see. Jeff Jones and Eleanor Stein were finally arrested in 81. He got probation and became an environmental writer and activist in upstate New York, where he and Stein live today. She received a law degree, and she's an administrative law judge with the New York State Public Service Commission. Michael Kennedy, who represented certain of Weather's leaders, is today one of the most prominent attorneys in New York. He has served as a special advisor to the President of the United Nations General Assembly. He also owns High Times magazine due to an old marijuana client. Kathy Salia was finally captured after 25 years. And she got 2 consecutive 10 years to life terms. Let's see. Patty Hearst, released from prison in 1979, married one of her bodyguards, Bernard Shaw, settled down to a quiet life as a socialite and heiress, and has occasionally appeared in cameos and small roles in movies by John Waters. He says, Hearst, like many of those who lived underground all those years ago, rarely speaks of her experiences today. Few do. Many have moved on. Others will talk openly only with fellow radicals. Yeah, and then I'm not going to give Sakua Dinga the last word on this. Okay, that brings us to the end of Days of Rage. Here, wait. Let me go here and show it to you one more time in case you came in the middle. Brian Burrow, Days of Rage. Really recommend it to you. I think, yes, Ryan had a great idea of how to wrap this up, this series. We had started, now I get them mixed up, Ryan. Which did we start with and what are we going to end
We
with?
talked about the Munster Anabaptists, named after the town that they took over.
Right. But we're going to end with
Munzer, who was the leader of the Peasants' War.
Thomas Munzer in the Peasant War. Yeah, yes. And you would argue that Munzer definitely counts as left-wing terror, even many hundreds of years ago before the French Revolution, right?
Yeah, it's kind of going back to how we started. It's basically the same group ideologically, but without the cultish elements mostly. Munzer will lead basically peasant mobs in sort of a populist squabble against various princes of the Holy Roman Empire, and would be put down by those princes who also had the support of both, if I remember correctly, the Roman Catholic Church and the budding Lutheran Reformation. It's one of the few places where they came together and they just said, no, we do not believe in undermining God-given authority. This will lead to terrible places, and it did.
Yeah, right.
And if I remember correctly, I think one of the peasant rebellion's main symbols was a rainbow.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So we'll cover that to probably wrap up the series, Ryan. I think I'm ready to wrap it up with that. Many people have had ideas, and of course we could just go on and on and on with this, right? Left-wing terror, as we're highlighting in the series, has been with us for hundreds of years, most particularly with the French Revolution and from then on, and it's not over yet. It seems quite clear to me. Instead of it being handfuls of ragtag groups underground, now we're dealing with left-wing terror that's firmly lodged in the seats of power, in my view.
They run the world.
Yeah, throughout institutions, even in Christian churches, they essentially get what they want. If they aren't literally just the ones there, in the hierarchy. So yeah, this history, I hope you can agree, is not irrelevant to our lives at all. Unfortunately, it's all too relevant. And I'm remembering a quote I didn't read about the FALN. He says, we had no idea who they were, and we just thought the bombs could just go on forever, And that's sort of the feeling I have as we come to the end of the series and we read this language and just the language they use, and it's like, that's what I hear all around me now in every institution.
Yeah, the reason the bombs stopped is because they won culturally.
Yeah. So it's just a leftist boot stamping on our face forever is what it's feeling like right now. Anyway, sorry to sound black-pilled because I usually am not, but that's what the book leaves you feeling, I think. Okay, we read 2 super chats from Prince of Parma, Lady of Shalott. Thank you very much for that. We'll be off next week. Ryan and I plan to go to the Mises Institute, where Ryan will be presenting a paper, as well as another friend of mine. So I'm really looking forward to that. So we'll be off. Thank you, Lady of Shalott. We'll be off next week because of that. But then I'll be back with Black Horse 2 weeks from today, and that gives us 3 weeks, Ryan, on Munzer. Now, I have some material from Rothbard, but I don't know if you do you feel like you have plenty of material on that?
I mean, Rothbard would be good, because my main concern with this is that someone's going to be like, "Oh, yeah, Turnip's the Lutheran, and that's why he's focusing on the Peasants' War." So if we bring in a wide variety of views, hopefully people can enjoy this for the fact that the Peasants' Rebellion was a proto-leftist revolution that got put down, and not, this is Christian sectarian squabbling or something like that.
Right.
So I am perfectly fine bringing in whoever commented on it. So long as they add something that we can work off of.
Okay, well, I think that's everything. I don't know. Is there anything you want to shill or anything, Ryan?
Nothing that I can think of right off the top of my head. I don't think I have very much coming up. I would remind everyone who wasn't here at the beginning, go back and listen to the Old Glory Club's Alamo Day. It was this last Monday. We have a great amount of content and great quality of content that was put out. Raging Mandrill and I did an episode on immigration to Texas. If you really like demographics, but that's not the only one. We have a great deal of historical videos and discussions on the Alamo itself, on the Texas Rebellion Revolution. And then I believe our good friend Paul Fahrenheit will have an article coming out soon on the Mexican-American War, which was an inevitable consequence of the Texas Revolution. So make sure to keep an eye out from that. And as always, keep an eye out for the Old Glory Club. Might be worth noting, we have what appears to be a sister organization in the great country of Canada. Our good friend our good friend Patriarch, Black Horse.
Black Horse.
Yeah. He put out a tweet the other day saying that the Red Ensign Club, I believe.
We actually highlighted it last week, Ryan. The Red Ensign.
Yeah. So go check that out as well if you are Canadian.
That's on Substack.
If you're American, check out the Old Glory Club. And if you are neither of those and don't have a national club yet, get together and start it. Yeah, so
organize.
That's all I have to say.
Yes, the organized minority. Become it. Okay, I think we're ready. So thank you, everyone. This was a long episode today, I realized. I lost track of time. But really wanted to do justice to the end of this book and just the absolute insanity that was happening all around me throughout my youth, and I didn't even know. But hopefully now all of us know, and let us not forget. Okay, thank you. Goodbye, everyone.